Now, there are some names throughout history which just sound cool no matter what they're on. They just do. HMS Tiger is one of them. She's been on a. It's been ascribed to a varied level of ships, let's say. There have been a variety of vessels that have been called Tiger, up to and of course, and including, I would say, the biggest and the best of them, the battle cruiser, HMS Tiger, which is arguably the biggest battle cruiser, as in one word battle cruiser, ever built by the Royal Navy. Because whilst Hood ends up in that area, it starts out being a battle cruiser, two words for economic warfare, because that's what Jackie Fisher likes from his battle cruisers. Rather than ones that can fight each other, he wants ones which can do long-range cruising and beat up everything that's small in them. Preferably at long range. Nothing of equivalent size. Please, we just outpace those. But that's not what HMS Tiger was. HMS Tiger was the point at which the Royal Navy was trying to search for a faster battle line. They both were trying the fast battleship route with the Queen Elizabeth, and they were too conservative in their application of boilers, etc. They didn't even really get close, but they were trying. And with HMS Tiger, they're sort of approaching it from a different angle. Well, what's the heaviest battle cruiser we can build that can keep pace with the cruiser line? And that's the important thing. The speed is 28 knots. The speed of Tiger is 28 knots. That's the entry point for being a fast battleship. That's also the entry point. That's also where battle cruisers are aiming for in this period. There's quite a lot of vessels which are 27 knots, and those things. Aiming for 28 knots is a big thing because it's a power density situation, and it's a very useful speed to have. Let's say that it's enough of an advantage over 21 knots that you have a commanding advantage, and it's worth it because it's a 33% increase in speed. Whereas once you're going 32 knots over 20 compared to 28 knots, well, how much are you prepared to pay in terms of your ship's armoring and firepower, safety for those extra 4 knots? An extra what? 15% increase in speed? Less than 15%? How much are you prepared to pay? But Tiger through history has been 14 ships. 3 others were planned to it. They have 14 battle honours, stretching from Armada to Jutland. And, well, I was thinking the other day, you see, I try and think what future classes are going to be called. I was quite right about the Australians and what they were going to be called, and Type 26s. I managed to be correct about the Canadians, and I don't care if I'm right or wrong. It's just fun if I am right, and if I'm wrong, well, c'est la vie. And city class for the Type 26 in the UK. And then we've gone with the inspiration class for the Type 31s, which honestly I wouldn't have picked as a naming scheme under any circumstances. So I was completely wrong on that one. I was completely barking up the wrong tree. I thought, well, considering we're going for a presence mission vessels and we want to maximize their capability, maybe we go for traditional destroyer names like Sharpshooter and those sort of things. But no, they didn't. They went with inspirations. So this makes me wonder about the Type 83s. What are they going to be? And so I thought I'd stick it in this key ships video because I'm going to do a whole video. This whole video is going to be about design, construction, and the key ships motif of HMS Tiger. Well, this part goes to the name. There is one possibility which I keep returning to, which is the Royal Dukes for the Type 83s, i.e. Duke of Edinburgh and those sort of vessel names. That wouldn't surprise me to an extent. It would be in keeping with some of the things the Royal Navy's been doing lately with its capital units. There is always the chance they go with counties, but then they both have cities and counties in service. Now, they did have towns and counties in service in World War II, in terms of the towns being light cruisers. and the counties being heavy cruisers. So you could argue it fits, considering nowadays all escorts are pretty much the size of a cruiser because they expect to do the cruising role. They're all variations of cruiser scale size of vessels of what we had called them in World War II. Mainly because of the roles we require them. But there is another option. There is another option for the Type 83s, and I have been forgetting this, but I thought I should bring this up. The Big Cat option. You see, let's say the Royal Navy builds 6. They have Tiger. That's a long-term name. They have Cheetah, Lynx. They have Lion. Puma. And let's be honest, the big cats by history have had a variety of other names added in them. So even if you want to just keep to Tiger, Lion, and Lynx, which are probably the ones which are most historic in the Royal Navy, you could then have 3 other names included there. You could have the Duke of Edinburgh. You could have the Princess Royal. Let's be honest, naming a ship for Princess Anne would actually be appropriate because, let's be honest, there ain't no one tougher in the royal family currently alive than Princess Anne. I mean, that lady is a one-person wall of you will not get through. So Princess Royal would be rather appropriate for her. Would be a rather appropriate name for her. Duke of Edinburgh. Unfortunately, with HMS Edinburgh being one of the Type 26s, I don't think we'll get the Duke of Edinburgh. It's just, how do I put this? It's too close in the names, and the Royal Navy doesn't like to have ships which are too similar. There again, the Duke of Edinburgh would never ever be called the Duke of Edinburgh by the Navy in terms of how they'd be referring to it. So the actual confusion between her and HMS Edinburgh would probably be a chance of confusion would be very low. She'd be called the Duke. Or PP, probably. But, yeah. I think big cats could be about to make a comeback. There's other discussions I've been having various places where it just, people keep discussing with me the history of Tiger and Lion and Lynx. And I've been thinking about it recently. I've been hearing it from a lot of different places, these discussions coming. And so, yeah, I thought I'd put it out there. I think there is a good chance that it's a big cats revival. They might go counties. They might. They might go Royal Dukes, but I think big cats. I'm starting, from what I'm hearing, if it's announced anytime soon what naming scheme is going to be for the Type 83s, I'm not saying I'd put money, because that's not the sort of thing I normally bet on, but I'd certainly put a chocolate cake that I might bake myself on it. I might consider. If I had someone who was going to offer me something similar in return, if I won. It would be definitely a family bet. Kind of like the getting the 15,000 subscribers by Christmas. Please, 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 please like, share, and subscribe. I'll explain more in the Shameless book blog. So, HMS Tiger, 1913. Now, this is the sole vessel battlecruiser authorized in the 1911-1912 program. There is a historian called Siegfried Breyer who claims that she had a sister ship named Leopard, and that was to be part of the 1912-13 program, but was deferred as the 6th of the Queen Elizabeth class. However, there are no records of this in any archive I've gone and searching. And all the discussions I've found in that period are about fast battleships and pushing fast battleships. So, here is my theory on this. The Royal Navy are wanting to push the fast battleship, but they don't want anyone else to really realise they're pushing the fast battleship. What's the best way of hiding or pushing a fast battleship program? Look like you're continuing producing battlecruisers. And it's interesting to me that it was a German historian who's picked up on this in German sources and is saying this. And I'm kind of like the 13.5-inch gun started as the 12-inch special, and the 15-inch gun started as 13.5-inch, special sort of thing, and then there's a 15-inch special program, and there's a whole debate as to what that produces. But 18-inch guns appear, so we have a fairly good idea. I have a strong feeling that this is part of the Royal Navy's general bluffing going on, because you have the Lions, then you have the two Lions, then you have the Queen Mary, and then you have Tiger, and each one is an improvement on the previous ones, and it's a growth. It is a growth, and it's a growth in capability. And Tiger itself is only 4 foot longer and 17.5 inches wider than a Queen Mary. So she's a growth on Queen Mary, but she's not a massive growth on Queen Mary. She's not something which is coming out and is going to be, oh wow, we can really see the difference. If the ships are alongside each other and you are far enough away, you won't notice it. You will not notice that difference at all. And honestly, you probably won't notice the width unless they are literally next to each other and you're running across one and across the other and you're going, that took me a little bit longer. But it's only about a foot or so, only about a step or so longer to get from one side to the other. And lengthwise, as I said, you'll notice if you've got them next to each other, because you'll be able to go, oh, look, Tiger is parked behind Queen Mary, and I could see her bow peeking out that bit and her stern peeking out there. But honestly, they're not that different. So to an extent, the Royal Navy's been pretty darn homogenous in their battlecruiser development. Whilst they are improvements on each other, whilst they are capability improvements definitely on each other, they are not overwhelmingly so that they cannot operate with each other. Queen Mary could also do 28 knots, and the Lion class, which preceded them, could do 27.5 knots officially. Now, officially, I say this because the Lion class have 42 Yarrow boilers and are technically capable of 70,000 shaft horsepower under normal steaming. Queen Mary has 42 boilers, Yarrow boilers again, and is technically capable of 75,000 shaft horsepower under normal steaming and can do 28 knots. So that's an extra 3,000 shaft horsepower, and that's got her up the extra half a knot. And then HMS Tiger, well, she has 39 of the newer, heavier water tube boilers, so she's got 3 less than the previous ones. And she can generate 85,000 shaft horsepower, and that gives her officially 28 knots. The Royal Navy, always providing consistent engineering figures and honest answers to any question. Always. Always. In many ways, this vessel, though, is the Royal Navy's spirit animal for the period. I know, we like to talk about the Queen Elizabeth class, we want to talk about Warspite, we want to talk about all these things, but the spirit animal for the Royal Navy in World War I is HMS Tiger. She is probably one of the best built ships the Royal Navy has. And she's a special vessel. She has Brown Curtis direct drive steam turbine systems. Each a set consisting of a high pressure ahead and a stern turbines driving the outboard shaft. Low pressure ahead and the stern turbines driving the inner shaft. So basically what happens is the steam comes into the high pressure, and after it's worked through that, it then goes into the second part of the set, the low pressure, and drives that. So this is why we call them turbine sets, okay? If they're individual turbines, which they can be set up as individual turbines, and sometimes you can have even a turbine set per shaft. You can have a cruising turbine and a high-speed turbine on the same shaft as a set. So this is the thing, she's a special vessel. Everything is designed to eke out as much speed and as much power and as much capability as possible. She's armed with 13.5-inch guns in twin mounts. Now, here is some of the stuff that was considered in her studies, in design studies. They did look at 13.5-inch specials, but they weren't going to be ready in time. They did look at triple turrets, but they decided against it because they'd have had to increase the beam, which means they'd have to increase the length more. And those things, how do I know? They are considered, well, they're in various archives. You can find them in the naval constructors' records and what they're talking about. But in the Admiralty records, pretty much they're focusing in on, broadly speaking, the same designs. They're focusing in on a set, and I'll be getting to those in a second. But why am I talking about her as the spirit animal of the Royal Navy? She goes everywhere she's required, she fights everything she's required, and she's always eager to try and get close to the enemy. In this period, the Royal Navy spends a large chunk of its time focusing on, worrying about, wanting to get close with the enemy. And nothing typifies this more than HMS Tiger. Although, I would like to point out, she does manage to skip a few things of some of her counterparts. One of those is, if you look through her squadron, her history, she managed to avoid being used as a flagship for a large chunks of it. She avoids this. In fact, it's only really after Jutland, when Lion has to go and to be repaired, that she gets used as a flagship. This is partially because Beatty never seems to be as keen on her as he is on the other ships and on trying to get a Queen Elizabeth class. In fact, one could argue that one of the reasons why he doesn't jump aboard her is because if he jumped aboard Tiger, then that would make his case for trying to get a Queen Elizabeth class far weaker, because they look at you and go, but you've got a 28-knot ship that has 8 13.5-inch guns and is probably one of the best armoured non-battleships in the world. What's your problem? This is 28,500 tons in standard displacement of pure muscle and firepower. What's the problem? But Beatty was right in, there's a reason she's not, when they try and activate her earlier in her life because of the issues with Von Spade's squadron, basically Beatty goes, look, she's just going through training and testing at the moment. She currently has 3 out of 4 dynamos out of action, and they need to be repaired. They've had bad weather, which has impeded training, and it's unprepared and inefficient. And we send it down there, yeah, it'll fight, but it won't fight well. And for the Royal Navy, having just spent £2.6 million, including armament, on her, they didn't really want to risk her. But that figure of 2.6 million is why, as I've talked in the previous video about Tiger Cubs, the smaller cruisers, the armoured, the sort of the 9.2-inch gun heavy cruiser, realistic heavy cruisers, start to make sense, because even the Royal Navy in this period, that's a lot of money, £2.6 million, and you're not going to be able to get enough ships to do all the roles you need large cruisers for if you're spending £2.6 million a time, and they're just getting bigger and heavier. So, shameless book plug. Now, shameless book plug, what is it all about? Well, it's basically shameless self-advertisement of my book, mentioning the fact that I've got another book coming up, and, well, because I'm a naval historian and a university lecturer, these roles are in many ways, especially the university side, are driven by how many books you sell, so and how your journal articles get cited. So I do some shameless self-promotion. I also like to use this section to say thank you to everyone for supporting the channel. You make all my research possible, because you're what funds my research. I don't have to go and sort of apply for grants and tick boxes or anything of that sort of nature. I can just go and do the research, and I can do it as I feel it needs to be done, to the extent I feel it needs to be done, thanks to you and your support. Not always the most sensible or profitable route for me, because this means I produce things which aren't necessarily going to be bestsellers or win me all the awards, although thanks to you I have had an award. I have had a commendation for my social media and my work on that in promoting the naval sphere. So thank you for that. But it's certainly the side I feel fulfilling on doing, and it's all thanks to you and thanks to your support of this channel. So thank you very much for all that. So let's consider the origins. Now, I'm going to expand this a bit. So if you want to pause now to read the different designs looked at in the 1911-1912 program. See? Expanded. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And we're back. So the origins come with the Lion class and the Queen Mary. Queen Mary is always an interesting design because she has a few changes in her that sort of take her back to the traditional style where officers should be accommodated over the stern instead of having them amidships near their alert positions and sort of things like that. And the armour scheme included in the Lions and Queen Mary is vastly different to that on the Indefatigables and Invincibles. They actually have armour worth calling it armour, for starters. And then we have to look at the options. The options being considered for this for HMS Tiger for the design, and there are a lot of interesting ideas being put forward in terms of coverage. And these are the official designs. Okay, sort of I've already discussed some of the unofficial ideas being looked at, and you find in notes of various constructors, and that's always interesting to read and interesting to go through. But these are the official design characteristics looked at. They're all going to be armed with the 13.5-inch guns, with carrying 80 rounds per gun. 80 rounds per gun. So if you think about that, well, that is 640 rounds of 13.5-inch gun and a 13.5-inch shell. A and C, which were supposed to do, they were both sets of guns, are supposed to do 150 rounds per gun, but they won't have that as their rate of fire, whether they are 4-inch or 6-inch. Now, increase to 200 rounds per gun in design A2. And A2 is where things really start to push on. A and C were 16 4-inch guns, and then it's 16 6-inch guns. And as said, with A2, well, that's 200 rounds per 6-inch gun, 16 6-inch guns. So that's a nice 3,200 rounds of 6-inch ammunition. 2 12-pounders. They do end up with AA guns being fitted, so that's unsurprising. They started with them from the early on design, and the speed they're aiming for is always 28 knots. Up until you get to A2 star, where they're looking and working out how much to get to 30 knots. 108,000 shaft horsepower. 108,000 shaft horsepower. Now, there's an interesting question is that A2 star has 42 boilers of the new design which Tiger gets. I'm sorry. So you can say the differential between A2 and Tiger is 3 boilers. Now, interesting thing is, how much extra space would that really have required? How much would they have to build into the ship to get those extra 3 boilers in? And 42 boilers into the steam system to provide you the steam for all those turbines. Ooh, that could have been interesting. That could have been interesting. And when you think about it, A2 double star is 28,500 tons in total weight of equipment, armament, machinery, fuel, armor, hull, everything. 28,500 tons, which is the weight which Tiger is in standard displacement. 28,500 tons. She's heavier than Renan and Repulse. And she is built because the German ships certainly are battle cruisers. They always have been. They've always had a bit of the second line battleship in their genetic makeup. And the reason they've had this is because for the Germans, they don't have enough ships and they're going to have to fight their way out of the North Sea to get anywhere interesting. And that means they can't keep dodging the fight. For the British, well, the battle fleet is there to do the fighting. The battle crews are there to exercise control of the sea, to win you the power over the sea, the dominance, exercise your power over the sea. That's what it's there for. And that's the difference. That's the difference between the two, and why you have the Invincibles and the Infatigables be the way they are, and why you have the early, the Von der Tann, etc. be the way they are. But the British realise very quickly that, hang on, if they're going to start duking it out with the German battlecruisers, then their battlecruisers are going to be at a disadvantage. So they need to build a battlecruiser which can both fulfill their global cruising role and also fight the German battlecruisers. And this is where the expense really starts to come from in the battlecruiser program. This is when they start to really get expensive. This is why you have a £2.6 million HMS Tiger. This is why. Because you're having to do both the job the Royal Navy wants her for, and the job the Royal Navy has to have it for. It has to be able to do both roles. And to do both roles, it's going to be expensive. It's also going to demand you push more. And it's a really interesting thing to think of in that some regards people talk about Hood, etc., all these things being fast battleships. There's an argument with Tiger because of this, because their decision is to get rid of those 3 boilers and use that weight for extra protection, extra subdivision. That realistically, Tiger is heading towards the fast battleship far more than any of the others. Because she's built from the ground up like it. She is a battle cruiser. She is definitely on the battle cruiser portion of that lovely scale, the lovely sort of spectrum that we talk about. But she's edging very close to the fast battleship. Very close. And in fact, if she'd been properly modernised in the 1920s and 30s, she could probably have edged over like a couple of the Congos do, in my opinion. So let's consider the vitals of HMS Tiger. Now, the reason I emphasise the 28,500 tons is because, as standard and normal displacement, is because that's what the Royal Navy claims. The Royal Navy submits to the Washington Naval Treaty that Tiger is 28,500 tons in standard displacement. That's also the figure you often use for her normal displacement. So I would suggest perhaps the Royal Navy, when they're sitting in for the Washington Naval Treaty, might be over-egging Tiger just a tad to give them room to expand her and improve her. She is still a very vital ship in the 1920s. She is still a very viable vessel in the 1920s. With her speed and her firepower, she is something which is a vital national asset in the 1920s. And that cannot be underestimated, her value. There is a reason she stays around. She's the important thing to maintain the squadron. The Royal Navy is always trying to keep the battlecruiser squadron at least 3 vessels. If you have Tiger, then if a Renown, Repulse or Hood is in refit, then Tiger is there, and you're at 3 vessels still. She's still viable for the role. In fact, her entire end of service is due to the fact that she's kept in service long enough to cover Hood being in refit before she's withdrawn from service. And the interesting thing that comes up there is, well, if Hood's refit had been delayed a couple of years and she'd been kept around a bit longer, what would have happened? What would have happened? With the world going tension, would the Royal Navy have got rid of her, or would they have upgraded her? Because if you're going to produce twin 14-inch turrets for the King George V's, do you decide to change Tiger over to twin 14-inch? What do you do with her? She's an interesting design. She's an interesting capability. Now, she has a length of 704 feet. Now, that's roughly 228 feet shorter than the Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carriers, the new ones. So if you see them, and you look at them, and you look at their length, they are 932 feet long. So if you take off roughly a quarter of their length, you get an idea for what the length of Tiger was. Beam, 90 foot 6 inches. 90 foot 6 inches. 27.6 metres. Again, not a lot narrower than the Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carriers. Draft, 32 foot 5 inches. Shallower drafts than the Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carriers. But all in all, she's in keeping with the other battlecruisers of the Royal Navy at the time. She's a little bit longer, a little bit broader than Queen Mary, which was a little bit longer, a little bit broader than the Lion class, but they could operate together. They fitted together as a group. As a set, they worked. And most importantly, if you're looking at them from a distance, you can't really tell them apart that easily. You can sort of work out which one's Tiger from the position of the stacks, because her stacks are all forward. But Queen Mary and Lions all have 2 stacks forward and 1 stack further aft in terms of their funnel arrangement. So you can sort of pick out Tiger as being different and at range, but from the front, no. And all of them carry 13.5-inch guns. And she has, in terms of her power, well, she has 39 dual-fuel water-tube boilers. Dual-fuel, they're both coal and oil. They supply 2 steam turbine sets, as I said, which are split up so that the high-pressure turbine drives the outer shaft. The inner shaft is driven by the low pressure, which is useful. This generates 85,000 shaft horsepower. Now, it's worthwhile noting that Queen Mary, in testing, when she was doing her testing, was found to have achieved 83,000 shaft horsepower. And the phrase often uses, she only barely exceeded her speed of design speed of 28 knots. And this comes up so often, and is such a standardly used phrase of barely exceeding that it's made into several books, as well as into the Wikipedia entry. And speaking as a historian, and speaking as someone who has ever dealt with anyone as a lecturer, who's occasionally, when I have students in front of me and something's happened and everyone is giving me the same phraseology to describe an event, I get suspicious. When I hear everyone using the exact and the fact that it's barely exceeds as design speed, and that's at 83,000 shaft horsepower is 28 knots. She's achieved 83,000 shaft horsepower, and she's getting 28 knots when she was designed to achieve a speed, and supposed to achieve a speed of 75,000 shaft horsepower. So you're telling me this vessel makes 8,000 more shaft horsepower than she was officially designed to, and she barely exceeds her design speed of 20 knots? There's either something really wrong and inefficient going on with your turbines and their power to the shaft and propeller design, or you're lying. You're lying. There's only 2 options. And then you got Tiger, which has 39 even more powerful boilers. Well, she's interesting because she, when we're measuring her, is officially only ever measured in wartime to her 85,000 shaft horsepower. And officially had a maximum of 108,000 shaft horsepower, although in her sea trials was only tested up to 104,635 shaft horsepower, which meant she got a speed of about 29 knots officially. But if we go back to this, we'll see that 100,000 shaft horsepower should have got her to 29.5 knots. 108,000 shaft horsepower, which is what she gets when she's forcing her boilers, but she's rated for when she's not forcing her boilers. That's the thing, she's rated when she's not forcing her boilers. 108,000 shaft horsepower. But officially she doesn't get to that. Officially. So, again, Tiger. Honestly, she's a 28-knot battle cruiser. She is. She's a 28-knot battle cruiser. She's just 28 knots. She might have achieved 29 knots, is the speed we're admitting in testing, and that might have been when she was doing was achieving 104,655 shaft horsepower out of a theoretical maximum of 108,000 shaft horsepower when the boilers were having forced draft. But yeah, but the other interesting thing to her is her fuel consumption. Daily fuel consumption was 1,265 tons. That's 1,245 long tons a day at 24 knots, which would give her an endurance of somewhere in the region of 3,300 nautical miles. Which is, how do I put this? We put that in context is sort of Queen Mary, the vessel which was before her, could do 2,400 nautical miles at that speed. So she could achieve 900 more nautical miles at the same speed. And please note, all that information, I first learned about it in reading the works of John Roberts, and usually it's far easier to find his Battle Cruisers book, which was published in 1997 by Naval Institute Press. But there's also Design and Construction of Battlecruiser Tiger, which was published in Warship 2, Conway Maritime Press, and it's a really interesting read and really interesting discussion. But John Roberts is sort of the one who started all the research, and if you go and read his documents like I did, you can then go and find the files. Now, the reason I had to admit I went into this on battlecruisers was because guess where the Royal Navy got their metrics and design ideas for their aircraft carrier hulls from in the 1920s and 30s? They're looking at battlecruisers. So I went and I found John Roberts' book. I found all the archive information there, all the documents to go and look. Went and looked them up. And then I immediately found very quickly, oh, this is the document they were referencing here, and the document they were referencing here. Which is why battlecruiser engines and battlecruiser hull design is something which I've always been rather interested in, because it fitted into a lot of my other research. And the more I studied it, the more I found it very intriguing and interesting to look at this sort of spectrum and look at these ships and go, oh, it's so much more than the armour, isn't it? It's so much more than the thickness of the armour. In terms of thickness of the armour, though, well, she has got a 3 to 9 inch belt armour, between 1 and 3 inches of deck armour, 8 to 9 inches around the barbettes, which is pretty darn tough, 9 inches on the turret, and 6 inches on the casemates. That's all solid armour. Which befits her rather interesting firepower in terms of her 8 13.5-inch guns, her 12 case-mated 6-inch guns, her 2 3-inch air guns, and her 4 fixed 21-inch torpedo tubes. This is a ship which is designed and loaded to go and fight, and that's what Tiger was all about. Which makes her service entry so much fun. Despite her abrupt start to her career with training, trials, and all those things being cut short because of, well, the Battle of Coronel, because of what von Spee was up to with the East Asia Squadron. And despite Beatty's fears, Tiger, under the command of Captain Henry Pelly, was very quickly put into fighting order. Pelly was described as a charming person and a very efficient officer by Beatty. There is a strong undercurrent that as much as he liked Pelly, Pelly would never make his flag captain. Pelly was a very, very skilled officer, but he managed Beatty in many, many ways, and the fact he went on to become an admiral, even on the retired list, shows the standing he was considered in. He was a skilled officer who was very suited to being Chief of Staff to Admiral Sir Henry Jackson in his roles. He had been flag captain to Lord Charles Beresford, but was always able to talk with the Fisher faction as well as the Beresford faction. In fact, one could argue that Pelly was probably one of the most flexible officers available. He had actually been placed on half pay in 1909 and had asked for a shore appointment, but it was the fact that he was appointed to command of Invincible in 1913 after being made captain superintendent of contract-built ships, and then he gets Tiger before her commissioning. You know, he was put into this position because he was a trusted officer, a skilled officer, and honestly, he didn't really want the senior rank. Whilst he stays in as a Rear Admiral and Vice Admiral, and he gets various roles, including being Rear Admiral in charge of Gibraltar and Senior Naval Officer Egypt and Commodore in charge of the Royal Navy Barracks Portsmouth, etc. at various points, he never really wanted to be more than a captain. And he was a fine captain, a very good captain. And he was a decent Rear Admiral and Vice Admiral. He honestly didn't do a bad job. There's nothing I can really complain about with him, but it's just, it doesn't seem to be what he really wanted. He was, requesting to go on half pay in 1909 and, requesting a shore appointment or temporary service in the Admiralty. That's not what you do if you're pushing for your career. After you've just been flag captain to Beresford and in command of King Edward VII from March 1907 to March 1909, previously commanded Venerable. So he's done command of 2 battleships, 2 good, solid battleships, and been chief flag captain to Beresford. You would expect him to have jumped up the ranks rather quickly. You'd expect him to be a far more senior officer by the time it came to World War I. But he hadn't. He basically sat around on shore appointments for 4 years. And then he gets Invincible. And the fact he gets Invincible in 1913, when she's not really a frontline ship, suggests the Navy's short of captains. When I say frontline ship, she's no longer the first rank of battle cruisers in the Royal Navy. There are newer, better ones. There's a big cat-centered service. And the Infatigables. So she's well down the list. But he's still a respected officer to get that. It's just the Royal Navy needs more captains at sea, and he's respected, he's good, we'll put him in there. And then, from that, he goes to being, I said, Chief of Staff to Admiral Sir Henry Jackson. And then he gets command of HMS Tiger. And he commands her till well after the Battle of Jutland. He commands her to the 29th of June 1916. He is her first captain. And that's August 1914 to June 1916. And he does a good job. A really good job. Of setting the ship up, of starting the traditions, of getting the ship ready to fight. And one of the interesting things I said is, on her service entry, she's not considered that great because of the situation she finds herself in. But very quickly that is reversed, and very quickly she becomes probably the most reliable vessel in the battlecruiser fleet. To be honest, at the Battle of Dogger Bank, which is not that long afterwards, if we consider this, because we're talking October 1914, she'd started her trials and her commissioning. And it's the Battle of Coronel takes place in November. And then the Battle of Dogger Bank takes place in January 1915. So we're talking the space of less than 4 months. You look at her involvement in the Battle of Dogger Bank. She is fine. She does absolutely great work. And she's also the ship which can do the most stop the enemy getting away. I know I've discussed this before, but you have Lion, which can do 27.5 knots. You have Princess Royal, which can do 27.5 knots, and you have Tiger, which can do 28 knots. And they pretty much are doing 27 knots to try and to hunt down the German fleet at the Battle of Dogger Bank. Now, we all know Tiger could have pushed past that. It's probably not sensible for her to do it, because I don't think she could have soloed the entire German first scouting group solo. But she is one of the vessels which opens fire as soon as she can. Lion opens fire first at a range of 18,000 meters at 20,000 yards. And Tiger, though, opens fire not long after. And whilst they don't score their first hit on the Blucher until 0909 hours, which is, what can I say, 17 minutes after opening fire, and if you consider their rate of fire of their guns, that's probably 30, and that could be as many as 30 salvos in. Probably isn't. Some of their accounts say it's about 16. Because they're doing, rather than aim, shoot, 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 they're doing aim, shoot, look for fall of shot, recalculate aim, shoot, look for fall of shot, and that takes longer, that delays. The ranging shots are always going to be a far slower rate of fire than we've got the range, now pelt everything at that range and we're just going to track them and hope we hit. Yes, you've heard of beaten zone with a machine gun. Well, that's pretty much what you do with heavy artillery salvo firing at this point, but we'll leave that to one side. The thing is, the first scouting group didn't open fire till 2 minutes after they'd scored their first hit on the Blucher. And first scouting group concentrated their fire on Lion, which is good because they're concentrating on good old Beatty. But honestly, they probably should have been concentrating on Tiger, which has the far better fire control, has the latest edition of turret organization and turret systems, and has Pelly as its captain. An officer who, how do I put this politely, has differing views on how to calculate gunnery. Let's point this out. He was a man who had commanded multiple battleships, and even Invincible. He had a very... The thing is, he come under Beresford's command as Flag Captain being okay, being accepted and supported by him. This man is a gunnery specialist. He knows his battleship and his main caliber guns, and his views on gunnery are not the same as the rest of the battlecruiser fleets. In fact, they really don't accord with them, in some regards, as the time goes on. Now, the trouble is, at 09:35 hours, Beatty, and this is Dogger Bank, signals what is the most sensible command he can come up with at this point: engage the corresponding ships in the enemy's line. Captain Pelly looks out, looks at Indomitable, thinks, well, Indomitable's already engaging Blucher. Frankly, Indomitable is all that needs to engage Blucher. So I'm going to aim at Seydlitz. Now, Lion also decided to engage Seydlitz, which is what left Moltke free to continue attacking Lion without risk. But it kind of makes sense what Pelly was thinking through, because he was looking at the instructions of his commanding officer and going, well, we have 5 battle cruisers here, battle cruisers and battle cruisers. 1 word and 2 word ships here. And let's consider this. The Germans have 4 vessels, Seydlitz, Moltke and Deflinger and Blucher. We have Lion, Tiger, Princess Royal, New Zealand, Indomitable. You don't need me to engage Blucher. Blucher is no value for me to engage. I am a 13.5-inch gun battlecruiser. That's what I've got on my command. Why would I be engaging the Blucher? Indomitable matches up with her. Let her engage it. That's fine. Let her blast away. You know, we've already got an overmatch here. You'd think what you do, and this might sound stupid, but this is a fact. Considering the line goes Lion, Tiger, Princess Royal, New Zealand, and Indomitable in a line, and it's Seydlitz, Moltke, the Flinger, and Blucher, theoretically in the line. Well, you think Lion and Tiger would take Seydlitz, Princess Royal would take Moltke, New Zealand would take the Flinger, and Indomitable Blucher. Because Indomitable will smash Blucher, Tiger and Lion together concentrating on Seydlitz would smash her. And if they did, well, then they could work their way down the line. And that's what you do. But they don't. They don't do that. Now, you could also say, well, hang on, the Flinger, Moltke, Seydlitz, they're more powerful. So let's Indomitable New Zealand concentrate on Blucher, wipe that out, and then concentrate, and then move up the line from the stern of the line to the front. And Princess Royal matches into the Flinger, Tiger to Moltke, and Lion to Seydlitz. And it makes perfect sense for Tiger to be engaging Moltke in that scenario. What doesn't match is why Lion's engaging Moltke as well. But because of the phraseology, and the Germans are slightly ahead, the basic phraseology of these is you match up against the vessel you are next to, and that's what Lion does. But Tiger takes us, you match up against the one which is in line with you. So in your corresponding number in the line. Because, as I said, pretty much Tiger was level with Blucher. They don't need to. And really, at that point, you needed the signals to be properly examined. But, well, because they'd sunk the Blucher, it was considered a victory, and so everyone counted over that. There's also some weird discussions which go on afterwards. One interesting thing is that Pelly is being pointed for the amount of gunnery practice he's done, and the gunnery practice he's managed to do. But this leads to issues, as with Lord Fisher. Never one to not criticise anyone who is mildly associated with Beresford. Tiger's gunnery seems to have been villainously bad on January 24th, yet she seems to have had a lot of practice. Now, of course, she had actually only hit, I think, the Flinger and Seydlitz with one shot each, and as they recorded it, out of the 355 shells she fired. So that is accurate. It's just, to an extent, Tiger seems to have been recording things in a slightly different way than the others in terms of what hit she makes. Because when you look at the policies and look at the systems, you do suggest she might have actually hit more, but they were recording far stricter rules of they had to see the hit themselves to verify it. Always fun when you're doing that. But the criticism doesn't end there, because of course Beatty does both criticise them for not following his standing orders, despite the fact that whilst he's issued the standing orders, he hasn't done the customary thing of inviting Pelly over to dinner to discuss the standing orders with them and explain them in fully if Pelly has any questions. But there again, Beatty never does that. Beatty organises a mass social gathering for all the captains to sit down together and expects them to discuss the things in that kind of scenario. And this is the post-Edwardian Navy. This is a post-Victorian Edwardian Navy. It's not going to do that still. It's still at the point at which you do not criticise your admiral publicly. So if you disagree with their standing orders, it's got to be a private one-on-one conversation. And the great thing about having group conversations is you will never hear it, so you always think you're wonderful. But the biggest thing was, he puts a whole thing about them not playing standing orders, but he still thinks, it's understandable that they've done it because of the situation they found themselves in with their training, etc., and very carefully couches his remarks so that he's made all these criticisms on file, but then he's accepted it, so, he doesn't want the Pelly replaced. It's a very political manoeuvre, because if you really do have an officer you have that many problems with, you think has done this bad a job, you should be replacing them. You should be getting rid of them. Even at this time, If Jellicoe, if he'd written a similar report about someone, their next appointment would have been to the Falkland Islands, if they were lucky. That's actually got people and penguins and things to see. I'm not talking about a vessel at the Falkland Islands. I'm talking the Falkland Islands itself, just being posted ashore. Beatty puts in this whole thing of, he's sure that they'll develop and be able to follow his instructions in the future. The most Weasley statement, honestly, the more I read of Beatty's personal papers about this period, and the more I go through them, then they were published and you can buy a book of them, the more and more I really don't think he was suited to be an admiral. I think he was a good captain, I just don't think he has a temperament for an admiral. At the highest level, he's quite good at the politics, because he's got the political cachet and he's able to do it, and as said when discussing modern things, the classic example is currently in the UK there are protests from farmers over inheritance tax, and the person in front of it is Jeremy Clarkson. And people like to point out, well, Jeremy Clarkson shouldn't be in front of it because he wrote a few years ago when he first bought a farm that he bought it for tax reasons. And that was true then. But then he started farming it himself, and he's done a whole series of it, and he's actually quite a good spokesman for the farming cause. Because of this problem, people go, well, it shouldn't be him. The question is, who else should it be? He's got the political cachet, he's the most well-known, he's the most well-known in the public, he's got the media presence. There isn't a better option than him. And it's the same with Beatty as First Sea Lord. He's got the political cachet, he's got the capabilities, so there isn't a better option than him. There isn't a better option than him. But that doesn't mean he's perfect. That doesn't mean he's great. That doesn't mean you automatically like everything about him or like everything he does. Sometimes that's just the way the cookie crumbles. Sometimes you have to work with the people who are there and who are available, rather than your image of what a perfect spokesman for such a cause would be like. A perfect person. So yeah, BT has issues, Pelly has issues. But Pelly's going to be in charge till Jutland, and, well, honestly, for most of World War I career, the big things, Pelly's in charge of. And the fact that the ship survives, all it does, comes down as a testimony to its design, but also, I would argue, to its crew, and the crew which Pelly has created. And you cannot argue anyone else has created this crew. He's the captain from the very beginning. He takes command of it before she even commissions. And he forms that crew up. He forms it up as the best as his best ability he can do. And at Jutland, she's actually a good ship. In the battlecruiser fleet, she's probably got the best gunnery of all of them. Although, once again in the Battle of Jutland, how do I put this? Tiger misses Beatty's fire distribution order, same as Queen Mary does, and so Tiger engages Moltke, which is when Beatty had thought she should engage Seydlitz. That's, how do I put this? Not unusual. It seems to me by Jutland you've got a situation where increasingly captains of the battlecruiser fleet are ignoring the commands coming from Beatty. When you've got two senior captains, like Pelly, like Captain Cohen of the Princess Royal, these senior officers who are blatantly ignoring your instructions, your force's command and control is broken down. You are not winning because of you, you're winning in spite of you. And it goes worse when you start working down, because when you start working down the list of senior officers and a list of personnel not taking notice of Beatty. And literally you can almost go for the longer a captain or an admiral has served with Beatty, the less likely they are to take notice of his instructions in battle. And that's arguably why some of the ships possibly are put in the positions they're put in during the Battle of Jutland. There's also the fact that Beatty almost tries to over-control his force, but we'll leave that to one side. This is not a slamming Beatty session, this is a what did Tiger do? But the trouble is, once you're involved in any battlecruiser force, it does come back to their interplay between the captain of that vessel and Beatty, and the interpretation of the orders which Beatty is giving. And Pelly certainly did feel he could interpret the orders. Now, as I've talked about before in the sort of the Battle of Jutland, Tiger's hit many times. In the run to the south period of the battle, she's hit, I think it's 17 times? 17 times. And all but one of those, 16 times, she's hit by Moltke. 16 times. That's where I got the 16 from, because I have a little note which is hit 16 times by Moltke. Hit 17 times overall. 16? 17? 16 times by one ship. She's basically engaging Moltke for the battle. And she's quite exposed. She's often the closest to the Germans. She's taking heavy damage. She has to swerve to avoid the Queen Mary when she blows up. And yet, Tiger, which takes furious damage, doesn't. Tiger doesn't do that. And look, listen at some of these points of damage and some of these points of impact. Just read them. These are positions which, if hit, depending on how your ammunition storage is going on and how your things are going on, that could have caused massive issues. Look at the burst. Look at the damage in that picture of the burst over Q turret, and the fact and what it blew in the center of the sighting hood. Look at that hole with those two men staring through. That's Q turret. That's the damage. If you have ammunition handling like the rest of the battlecruiser squadron, the rest of the battlecruiser fleet, well, it's hard to see how you survive hits like that. It's hard to see how you get away without being mortally wounded, like other battlecruisers were in this battle. Because, let's be honest, most of the damage done to battlecruisers was not just down to their armor or their distribution of protection and their subdivision. It was down to the ammunition handling which the battlecruiser fleet, squadrons and battlecruiser fleet had fallen into, because of where they could do their gunnery practice and how often they could do their gunnery practice to focus it, that they ended up focusing on speed and rapidity of fire rather than actually accuracy of fire. But with Tiger, you could be simple as go for the simple answer as some do. Oh, she was just the best made battle cruiser of her period. She is actually the best battle cruiser, one word, that the Royal Navy ever built. So let's be honest, Renown and Repulse, they are battle cruisers, two words, in their designs, thanks to Jackie Fisher's influence. And even the Admirals start out as that. Yes, they evolve on, and they are evolved. Hood is evolved, but she's, I would argue, when you consider the density and subdivision over the hull, Tiger's better than Hood. Tiger is better. But no, that to me doesn't explain anything, realistically. The damage being sustained should have done more damage. Or rather, the hits being sustained should have done more damage. Or I was trying to say, it was the damage inflicted should have actually caused more damage internally, because if she'd been following those procedures. But she didn't. She wasn't. This meant she survived, and she's back in service relatively quickly. And she serves throughout the war. Even post-Jutland, she takes part in the various events, and when the Royal Navy comes close to engaging the Germans at several other points, she's usually there. She does get a refit from November 1916 to January 1917 at Rosyth, and then her deck and turret and roof armour are all reinforced. She gets additional rangefinders, which is always nice. But yeah, she did support and carry out support operations during the Second Battle of Heligoland Light on the 17th of November 1917, but never got within range of the Germans. And she got us up with Camel mounted on Q turret And a searchlight platform was added onto her third funnel later on in the war. But, yeah. Pretty much the big thing that happens to her that allows you to visually see changes, when she has a refit in 1918, which sees the topmast shifted to the top of the derrick stump, and gets a far more substantial, far more built up observational platform on the foremast. This allowed also rangefinders to be replaced with longer ones, because basically the wider rangefinder is, the more accurate it tends to be. Or rather, the greater range and more accuracy you can have. This did lead to an interesting conversation the other day, whether ships were limited in their range by their rangefinders or by the angle of the guns, or whether the angle of the guns was not worth increasing because of the angle of the rangefinders. Rangefinders always exceed, the visibility of rangefinders always exceed the range of the guns. Always exceed it in normal weather conditions. Okay, in fine weather conditions, the rangefinders will always be able to see further than the guns can shoot. They have to be, because you have to be judging and getting the information, producing target information before you get your opponent into range. This is why the Royal Navy opens fire so often at maximum range as they're closing. Some navies like to hold their fire until they're closer. The Germans are good examples. The Kaiserlich Marine especially has a habit of holding its fire until the British get closer. This can have the perception of making them seem like they're more accurate, because they're firing at short ranges where accuracy is enabled and is made easier. But it's a case of, it means that they are less likely to get that 1 in 100 shot which lands at long range and causes untold damage before you even get that. The British basically go with it because the British go, we're carrying enough shells, we can do this. We can afford to waste a few salvos which may or may not hit on a long shot. That's why the British usually open fire before the Germans do. Of course, the Americans and Japanese both end up trying to develop a doctrine where they're going to do long-range engagement with battleships, where they're just going to be pummeling each other from long range. It's one of the interesting things of discussion at the point, is that some people therefore take that the differences in terms of doctrine that come out of World War One as meaning certain navies can't do long range fire or can't do long range shooting. No, the British and the other navies involved who have this idea of closing doctrine can still do long range firing and do often have the same capabilities, and the navies which can do the long range firing can also have often closing doctrine as part of their ideas as well. Just look at what Ching Li does in various night fights. That's closing doctrine. And the reason they have that is long range engagements are great, and you might end up fighting one anyway, because if your enemy's dodging away and trying to keep away at maximum speed and so you can't close, it's going to be a long range engagement, so you train for it and you have the capabilities for it. But if you can close, you can significantly increase your accuracy, and if you can control the speed and angle of the close, you can do it to best suit you. That's what speed advantage is for. It's not just keeping the enemy at arm's distance, it's choosing when you're closing and deciding what the speed of closing is going to be to best suit your guns. So you can use the fact of getting closer and a way that increases accuracy of both your range finding gear and therefore your gunnery to your advantage at the time which suits you. People often interpret speed and being able to decide battle as being able to keep away and choose when not to fight. It's also an advantage when choosing from what direction, angle, and how you're going to fight. As I've talked about before with the Nell rods, their advantage with having their guns forward and the advantage of the F3 design and other things with all four designs is you can close at a very sharp angle, so you can present a very narrow target of your ship against a broad target of the enemy, which gives them a very small area to concentrate their fire over a very while they have a very large area for you to concentrate your fire on. Now, the problem with that, of course, is if they do hit and it's going through the ship from that that angle, straight ahead or down it, is that it can cause a lot more damage because there's a lot more ship for it to go through than if it's going across. So it's a calculated risk of I'm presenting a narrower profile which gives you less chance of hitting me overall, makes it more difficult to hit me, but if you do hit me you're going to cause more damage. There is no such thing in war or conflict or any scenario where you can get payoff with no risk. Every one of them in this decision is a calculated risk. Tiger takes many calculated risks in World War One, and she pulls them off. And I would argue it's because the risks that Pelly's prepared to take stay with her. He's prepared to take risks. He's prepared to engage the enemy as closely as he can. He's prepared to run those risks. He's not prepared to take risks when it comes to ammunition handling. Or maybe his early career has just been too strong with him. And so that gives us to the 1920s. And post World War One, well, she has an interesting career. She really does. The Royal Navy immediately transitions in the 1920s, even before 1918, 1919, even before the treaties, into, okay, we've just come out of a major war. We know from history that what governments usually do at this point is start cutting things. So we've got to decide around the kernel of the fleet we need to preserve to carry out our duties and to be able to deliver what we're supposed to from the government, and what things do we need to preserve. Also, what we really need to do is make sure the ships we are going to preserve are in the best possible condition. By the time that she is in 1919 comes along, and after a 1918 refit, she has 2 flying off positions on. She has a flying off position, as you can see, on B turret. She also still has one on Q, and she can carry 2 fighters. She collides with Royal Sovereign, the battleship HMS Royal Sovereign, the R class, in 1920 while assigned to the Atlantic Fleet, and honestly doesn't do too badly afterwards. So she's in for a major refit during the Washington Treaty, pretty much, and is placed in reserve, technically. But she then gets a new 25-foot, 7.6 meter rangefinder fitted on X turret. Has her original 3-inch AA guns replaced by 4-inch guns. And finally, Q turret's flying platform is removed. And that's her 1920s. In 1924, she's recommissioned. Why is she recommissioned? Well, because there are ships which are going into maintenance. Renown, Repulse. They're all having things, and this is to try and keep the battlecruiser force up to strength. This is the same reason why Princess Royal had stuck around for the time she had. She's gone now, by this point, but, you know, she'd been kept around as well for similar reasons. And then she spends most of her time being a seagoing training ship, and basically covering for the other 3 battle cruisers. That's Renown, Repulse, and Hood, until 1929. Now, realistically, this point goes into the 1930s, and I decided to quickly, as I wasn't going to be talking about Nate for long, I wanted to still a very cool picture of Tiger, and I found this one from World of Warships, and I just thought, that looks cool. I know it's not a real picture of her. I know it's not real. But it's cool, and you won't persuade me otherwise. So I'm going to use it shamelessly. In 1929, Hood is going in for refit. And it's going to be a long refit. She's going to be out of service until 1931. That's 2 years with the Royal Navy's statement ship out of service. That's 2 years with the battlecruiser force at pretty much 2 ships. And so Tiger, which has been basically being the Royal Navy's floating reserve, we can call on this when we need it, is stood up to full service. Stood up. And joins into the battlecruiser squadron once more as a fully functioning member. And so for those 2 years, she's critical. As part of the British presence and discussions for the London Naval Conference, she is an active unit. Which is also kind of useful, because she's part of the reduction in battleship fleets and battleships and battlecruiser fleets agreed by the London Naval Conference. She was in commission until Hood came out of refit. And she is out of commission thanks to the terms of the London Naval Treaty. She took the cheers of the Atlantic Fleet in March 1931, paid off in May, and she was sold to Eva Kiffing for breaking up in February 1932. Interesting enough, when it comes to her breaking up, it doesn't seem to start immediately. It's a while before they get round to it. Now, you see, this is where I can get into trouble, because I would say this. I understand why the decision was made. They decided to keep Iron Duke around instead as a gunnery training ship. But I think myself Tiger would have been a better option, because Tiger is a vessel I could actually see in 1938, 39, the Royal Navy taking to one side and going, you know what, this has been a gunnery training ship. Let's rearm, let's put in new boilers and actually use this vessel, because she has a good baseline, she has a good hull. Yes, she's had war service, but the thing is, she's also been in service for for over a decade. Post-war, she's done it almost. She's getting very close to 20 years of service, and there haven't been the problems. There haven't been the list of issues you'd expect from a vessel which has been through very hard war service. And one of those things is because, and it's an interesting point to make, we know from her testing, we know from her systems that under forced draft, with all those things, she could make 29 something knots. She spends most of war, the maximum speed she's doing is 27 knots. Because she's being held by BT to the same speed as the Lion class. And that makes sense to keep them all together. And rather than having them do 27.5 knots, which you're not sure if they can reliably do. They could do it, but BT always seems to be quite cautious. However, keeping everyone to 27 knots keeps the fleet together. That's a sensible thing to do. But that means she doesn't have to use forced draft for pretty much the whole war. She never reaches her own maximum speed, and so rather than her engines and turbines being absolutely hammered by war's end, they're actually in pretty good condition. They're actually in pretty good condition, and so this is one of the reasons why she is kept around, and one of the reasons why she doesn't have the major expensive refit you'd expect to have a ship keeping post-war, because she doesn't necessarily need it to have as much of it refit soon. She has something works done on her engine. Please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying they're in perfect condition. They've just been through 5 years of hard war. That's not going to happen, but they're in good enough condition. They're in a good enough situation that it's very different. From what you might expect. Now, yes, they make the decision that, honestly, Iron Duke makes the more stable gunnery platform and therefore is best for gunnery training. And I can't argue that. But I would have argued, and there were actually officers who did argue at the time, but weren't necessarily in the same position they would be later on, that was not seeing the whole picture in terms of her abilities. And whilst, yes, she might not make as good a gunnery training ship, she'd have made a better case for modernisation upgrade in a crash emergency programme in the run-up to World War II. After all, if you're producing twin 14-inch gun turrets for the King George V's anyway, running off an extra 4 of them and being able to put them into the same, pretty much the same positions as the 13.5s is not going to be not going to be impossible. There's not so much difference between the two, and it's going to be a difficult match. Putting in new boilers, you can probably match, if not increase, her speed over what it was historically, officially, and still save weight. She could have been a 30-knot vessel without much effort on part of the Royal Navy. And 8 14-inch guns, 30 knots. She would have been a useful asset to have backing you up. Now, the question is, what does she go in instead of in terms of replacing? Well, most of the work on her is going to take place in a fitting out dock. So, honestly, if you skip her in at the right time in the build program, she's not going to interrupt any of the procurements and really take up any of the issues, cause any issues with other ships. The only thing she might do is might cause you to have worked out some of the kinks with the 14-inch guns earlier on. But, as said, they made the decisions they made, and I can understand why. I just feel it's worthwhile considering the other options. And yes, by the time in 1930s when she's going, she does need engine work. She does need things done on her. So yes, that is another factor. You would have had to do some work on her. But again, that's not necessarily a bad thing in that period, because if the Royal Navy's got to do some work on her, even to keep her as a gunnery training ship, and by putting in new boilers, etc., that puts them in even better condition for later, because if she gets her new boilers and new engines in the early 1930s, and so late 1930s, it's just a case of, we're going to change the guns to 14-inch guns, or even if you change them to 14-inch guns for her training role as part of the thing. Oh yes, we're standardizing on 14-inch guns, so for the King George V, we're going to upgrade the gunnery training ship to 14-inch guns. Maybe you've just given her 2 14-inch gun turrets forward, so she has 4 14-inch guns, and then later on you go, well, we'll add in 2 more turrets now and turn it back into what she was before. Maybe you've used the gunnery training role to get rid of the 6-inch casement guns and replace them with 4.5-inch turrets. A couple of those. Well, let's say 4 of those either side. You've got yourself a useful little ship. A useful ship. But that wasn't to be. They used Iron Duke instead, and the rest, as we can say, is history. So, summary. How do you summarize a ship like HMS Tiger? Some ships are powerful because of their name and the presence and history that comes to them. Some are powerful because of the crew that they inspire. Some ships are lucky and get both. There is a very small number of ships which achieve this. They both have a name which has a history of greatness, a history of service, a history of irascible deeds. Thinking about Warspite and the amount of battles that she started by just firing herself. Just going, I'm not waiting to be told to fire. HMS Tiger is also in that same list. HMS Tiger is one of those names which echoes through history. There are some who've written words such as this was the most beautiful battle cruiser, the most beautiful dreadnought ever built of her period, and I wouldn't want to argue with them. I really wouldn't. Because those lines are something special. That styling is something special. There is a symmetry to her, despite some of her asymmetrical positions and the 3 stack arrangement. She's a vessel which has bearing and has status. And the fact that she isn't just considered she's available so she'll sub in for Hood, but actually is kept around because Tiger is considered as viable as those other battle cruisers. She makes up the group. The 3 they want to maintain in peacetime, the 4 they want to have available for a wartime. Tiger's it. And let's be honest, if the Royal Navy in that period had been really worried they weren't going to get anything, then they would have pushed a second admiral through and completed it. And if you say the case, well, they couldn't complete them, they could complete them. They just had to be able and prepared to accept the compromises that have been worked into their designs to try and change them from battle cruisers to battle cruisers. And they didn't feel they had to, because they felt they could wait for the G3s, they could wait for other things, because they had this. They didn't have to because they had this. The Royal Navy's view is often is that she could fight a Congo. While she's around, they have no qualms. A Congo or equivalent vessel, they feel she can match up against them. And I can't really disagree with that statement. I can't really disagree with that as an idea, because as good as the Congos are, she's their equal. Okay, there's not a decisive advantage either way, truly, while she's around. And that's the important thing for the Royal Navy. It means they have a column of 4 fast ships, which means they can mank in and deal with the Japanese's 4 fast ships. And every other Navy's 4 fast ships. And so when she goes, there is a tiger-shaped hole in the Royal Navy's lineup, which you can argue is part of the motivation behind the speed requirements for the King George V's and the speed requirements for the Lion class, but also behind the creation of the Vanguard designs, and the designs which were going on. And realistically, the Vanguard design, the studies which lead to Vanguard, they don't just appear. The ideas of reusing old guns, of getting a fast ship into service quickly, they come into being in about 1934. And yes, there's a change in the Royal Navy's the Third Sea Law. There's a change in the Royal Navy's motives and preparations for war from about 1933 to 34 onwards. But that's where the really interesting thing comes, because when you've got people writing in 1934 and 1935 and discussing the decisions made in the earlier 1930s, that's where a lot of the ideas I discussed earlier about the fact that Tiger rather than Iron Duke should have been preserved. And there are many who put the preservation of Iron Duke down to a sentimentality because she was Jellicoe's flagship. They brushed it off. There were actually, I want to say there were honest and sensible reasons at the time. I don't agree with them because I balance things differently, and I, of course, have the colouring of hindsight. So I, therefore, cannot be claimed to myself to be an honest broker in this matter. But there are people even questioning within a few years going, I don't think we made the right call. I think we made the wrong call when we went for the wrong one. Because the options this vessel would have produced. So, today's question is going to be a rather interesting one for you. What do you think happens if Tiger does get modernized in the 1930s? In the early 1930s. Let's say she gets 2 turrets removed aft, and she gets new boilers, new stack arrangements, maybe some 4.5 inch secondaries put in because of the period she's going through it. First off, this will be a gunnery training ship. And then 1937-ish, they fit it with 14-inch guns. They go with that. They change it to 4 14-inch guns, 37, 38. And so she ends up being, let's say, a 29 knot. Let's say she's officially 29 knots of power, because she had achieved 29 knots before. As said on trials, and a few other times she has been clocked, been mentioned as going at that speed, not at full horsepower, but at 29 knots is the official speed given. I do sometimes wonder if, to use a phrase of one of the people who likes to chat in the Discord server after videos, sometimes is long, whether it's the Royal Navy's famous long knots in that you have the speed that you have regular knots getting up to the speed that they want to say the ship is, and then if anything afterwards, the knots are not a mile long, but are a mile and a half or 2 miles between them. So just goes, yes, this has only got to 29 knots. This has only got to 30 knots. Sort of thing going on. As it got to 29 and a half knots. So that's a knot every 2 miles rather than every mile. Oh. Oh, I'll take that. That sort of thing going on. I'm not sure, but I do think there is a level of the Royal Navy's doing a level of creative accountancy when it comes to the speed of their ships. But so let's say she's a 29 knot ship, and she's got 4 14-inch gun turrets. I mean, modernized to an extent with better AA. Better secondaries, 4.5-inch secondaries, and all 6-inch guns lost. And some more octables. What do you think she gets used for? What do you think she's doing? Where do you think she is? Frankly, I think the Royal Navy would really love an extra fast ship in service in that period. The other option, of course, is she gets modernised up to 15-inch guns, but that's going to be more difficult than putting in the 14-inch guns, which is... And this is the interesting thing. It's that scenario which actually, to me, makes more sense for the 14-inch gun decision for the King George V. Because, oh yeah, we can also modernise this rather useful 13.5-inch gunship up to a 14-inch and put that in it. But that's me being a little bit weird. I've already talked about what's coming up over the Christmas period. Year of the Aircraft Carrier is done. The Year of Leadership's coming next, and at some point I'm going to have this all written up nicely for you to be able to see what the Year of Leadership is going to be like and who's going to be covered in it. It's going to be an interesting one. Thank you very much. Take care. Hope you enjoyed, and have a nice day. Oh, and thank you for supporting the channel. Please do comment, share, and subscribe. I think that's what I'm supposed to say. But I'm really trying to reach 15,000 subscribers by the 24th. So any help, I'm within roughly 900 of the goal. Please, pretty please. I just want the bet between my mum and my aunt to be over. It's getting problematic.